Hi, Christopher.
Hi, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
And see me. And see me.
and see you. Yeah, all there.
Very good. Right. Okay, I'm going to switch my phone off because I don't need.
Oh, yes, that's a good idea. Thought something else to distract. Oh, we've actually got some rain at the moment.
Yeah, I got soaked walking the dogs.
Oh, right. Where do you live?
Bath.
Oh, lovely. Right, right.
But
yes, it's not been raining. It's only been raining about the last half hour or so here. It's been sort of threatening it all day and just being very cold.
Yeah. Right. I'm going to try. For some reason, just going to try share screen. Oh yeah. Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's better. Are you happy for me to stay on share screen at this point?
Yes, let's leave it like that. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Right. That's just about got me settled.
Yeah, fine.
So you're based in London?
Yes, yes.
Whereabouts?
Tooting.
Ah, fashionable Tooting.
Actually, I'm just going to, I know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to put in the chat the details of your book. Good. Yeah, 10 minutes to go.
No, we've still got plenty of time.
Yeah, yeah.
So presumably the Silver Society also includes silver, gilt and gold.
Oh yes, yes. No, it's really all precious metals and plate as well. Actually, we go into, but we don't go into pewter or brass or anything like that.
Yeah. No. Well, good. Well, I made that assumption. I should have asked you earlier. It's difficult to make the talk entirely about silver, gilt and gold, but I've got in as much as I can.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. I think people are very intrigued by it. Yeah, it'll be fascinating.
Well, I hope so. It will certainly. I'm certainly going to challenge your members.
Right.
Because I find that works quite well. So when do people start logging in? From about now?
They're logging in now, actually. Yeah, we've got about 13 at the moment.
Good. And how have you found lockdown?
Oh, variable. I must say, I've gone on doing these, running these Zoom talks rather longer than I did originally anticipate.
Yeah.
Um,
Did you
you
start
know,
very early on with them?
we started, I think our first one was in about June, when we realized, maybe it was sort of May, June, when we realized that even after sort of lockdown had finished, that we weren't going to be sort of getting back to having our normal meetings at the antiquaries anytime soon.
Yeah.
So yes, but I must say, I thought by the autumn that we'd be back to normality. Yes, I think this last one has, you know, the sort of the one which isn't over yet has gone on an awful long time, actually.
Yeah, it does seem like it.
And I think the trouble is, you sort of part of you sort of thinks, well, God, where's the last 4 months gone? But I suppose because nothing really has been happening to sort of mark events or anything, you've just been at home. It's just sort of meandered away, really.
Yeah, the thing I found the most difficult is the lack of variety.
Yeah.
That's why actually doing these talks is a huge fillip, because it sort of puts me on my mettle, and I have to think about something other than just writing.
Yes. Yes.
But on the other hand, it's been very good because I managed to get a book that I thought would take all year to do. I'm in the closing stages of finishing it.
Yes. Well, I think as long as you can access the sort of research material, that seems to be the problem that some people have had is you know, libraries not being open or not being able to access archives and things.
Yeah.
That's been a big problem for people. But if you've done all your research and got all your notes and everything, and only had to do the writing, then
well, I in fact have bought an awful lot more reference books than I would have thought I would have needed to. But and I have some online library access as well, so
yeah,
that makes life a lot easier. But I mean, the dread thing is the web, where one has to be just so careful not to take what the web says at face value.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
But in fact, I find I use Wikipedia a lot, but what I tend to do is to go down to the reference notes at the bottom and drill down into those.
Yes.
So you're not getting whoever wrote the article's spin on the whole thing. You're going back to the source material.
Yes, if you can get back to the original sources and actually what that is, then is actually, yes, you can then draw your own conclusions rather than conclusions.
The most challenging thing I've done since COVID started was last year, I suppose just trying to think when it was. It must have been last June. I was asked if I would effectively ghost somebody's memoirs. And although I hate that word ghost, and I refuse to accept.
Is this para bobsleigh?
Yeah. We did the entire thing without ever meeting.
That's extraordinary. Yes.
I'd never met him before. We did the whole thing over the telephone.
Goodness. Yes.
And I only got to meet him in that brief window we had around Christmas time. And that's it. You know, but we were able to, you get into a sort of momentum and a stride, and you find something that works, and it did work for us.
No, I suppose actually, if it's just sort of one-to-one on Zoom, as long as the Zoom connection is all right, then you can. It's really not that different to meeting someone, is it?
No. Although actually we did it using WhatsApp rather than Zoom.
Okay.
So I never actually. I mean, I knew what he looked like, but we never actually eyeballed each other.
Right.
But what was quite interesting, what I did was I take it down. I started off recording it, and then that was hopeless. So I'm quite quick at longhand. So I took it all down in longhand, then translated it into a chapter, and then sent it back to him to correct.
Right.
And and as he's got quite a strong Barbados accent, that throw up some quite interesting challenges.
Yes. Yeah. No, I've always been rather intrigued by the idea of ghostwriting. Actually, there was sort of I remember ages ago talking to someone who'd had to write Paul Gascoigne's, the footballers, memoirs, and he said actually this was when he was still being a footballer. So he said the hard thing was really sort of making a book out of it, because actually so little had happened to him. He played football all his life, and his life was football. And in a way, there's a sort of fine if your audience is just sort of football fans, then you can write in detail about the match between Newcastle and Liverpool in whatever. But yes.
No, I hate I must say I do hate the title ghostwriter. So I insisted that it was Corey Mapp as told to Christopher Joll.
Yes.
And actually there are chunks of the book that are pure me, because they're the sort of the history and the background to each of the chapters, and then he describes his particular experiences during that time. So not pure ghostwriting. I wouldn't want to do that. I think that's the ultimate in sort of hack activities. Right, 3 minutes to go.
3 minutes to go. Right, I think we'll try and get off punctually. Right, I think I make it 6:30, so we will start. Welcome to our next Silver Society Zoom talk. We're delighted that you're able to join us for what promises to be an intriguing evening in the stimulating company of the author Christopher Joll. After studying at Oxford and then attending the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, Christopher spent his formative years as an officer in that gloriously colourful regiment, the Life Guards, the senior regiment of the British Army, which was founded in 1650 and now forms part of the Household Cavalry, which is both an armoured reconnaissance unit and the ceremonial guard of the monarch. When he left the army after 7 years, which included 4 tours of Northern Ireland, Christopher worked in the city, the defence industry, and then PR, specialising in real estate. He also worked as a British military events director, managing the British military tournament. But from his earliest days, he has written articles, features, and short stories. His recent output has included Uniquely British, A Year in the Life of the Household Cavalry, The Drum Horse in the Fountain, Tales of the Heroes and Rogues in the Guards, and most recently, Spoils of War, The Treasures, Trophies and Trivia of the British Empire. He's also the author of the 15-volume military historical action-adventure series, The Speedy Cuts Saga, and is currently working on the memoirs of the former soldier, double amputee and world para-bobsleigh champion, Corrie Mapp. Christopher is also a video podcaster on YouTube, a trustee of the Art Fund Prize for Museums, and the regimental historian of the Household Cavalry. Once again, I would ask you if you have questions to put them in the chat box, and Christopher will try and answer them at the end of the evening. So without more ado, I will hand you over to Christopher.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucy, and good evening to all of you out there in Zoom land, and welcome to the wonderful world of Spoils of War, which for the purposes of this particular talk will feature as far as possible, because spoils of war come in all different shapes and sizes and materials, items of silver, silver gilt and gold, which Lucy assures me are covered by the Society. Now, I first became interested in this subject in 2015, when I was invited to talk on Radio 4 about the King of Spain's pictures in the Wellington collection. Now, this is something, the collection that is, that I'll come to in a moment. But my point in mentioning it now is that it led directly to my writing this book, which, as well as presenting a reasonably representative cross-section of spoils of war, also deals head-on with the controversial issues currently facing this subject. Now, the reason that spoils of war is a controversial subject is because there is a very sad lack of understanding about the difference between legitimate spoils of war and loot, which is, in my view, illegitimate. And this misunderstanding is distorting massively the current debate on restitution and repatriation, which frankly is distorted enough already by the PC views of the historical revisionists. Nonetheless, this is the subject that I want to engage you on this evening. Now, I think it's always helpful in such debates to start by defining terms. So here are the dictionary definitions. And herein lies the vital distinction between legitimate spoils of war and illegitimate loot. Spoils are profits, you might even say they're the silver lining, and loot is nothing more nor less than theft. Now, this is a distinction that the military recognizes, as the next 2 slides illustrate. In this one, you see in the left-hand corner, French eagles captured at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 being laid at the podgy feet of the Prince Regent. He consigned these potent symbols of victory to the Royal Hospital Chelsea, the National Repository for Battlefield Trophies, where they are still guarded by Chelsea pensioners. Now, in stark contrast, this is a notice placed on German property by the British Army at the end of the Second World War. Clearly, the military understands the difference between spoils and loot. And in case you doubt this statement, let me start by telling you about the first Duke of Wellington's attitude to and actions with regard to this subject. It's a simple fact that the Iron Duke absolutely deplored looting, and there are tales of it driving him into a great rage, as one of his Peninsular veterans noted in a letter home. Now, the reason for the Duke's rage was that not only did he regard looting as theft, but, possibly for him more importantly, it got in the way of fighting. At the Battle of Vittoria in 1813, Wellington came close to ordering the 18th Hussars, shown here in the top right of the slide, back to England for plundering King Joseph Bonaparte's baggage train, shown on the left, instead of pursuing the French as he had ordered. Now, to be fair to the British troops, a contemporary eyewitness noted that the haul of treasure arising from the defeat of the French at Vittoria was quite simply incredible. Joseph Bonaparte's privy purse alone was valued at 40 million gold francs, almost all of which was swiftly pocketed by the Spanish peasantry. But it wasn't just gold that Joseph had taken from Madrid. He'd also comprehensively looted, and I use the term advisedly, the royal palace. This looting had included rolling up and stashing in his coach the smaller pictures from the legitimate King of Spain's Old Master collection, shown here at Apsley House. Now, these pictures were discovered by Henry Wyndham, shown on the right, who would later make his name at Waterloo in the defense of Hougomont. And this collection of pictures, which included 3 Titians, was sent by Wyndham to Wellington, who in turn attempted to return the pictures to their rightful owner. Wellington actually wrote 3 letters to King Ferdinand, shown here on the left, offering to return the paintings to Madrid. Fortunately for Wellington's heirs, he received a reply from Count Fernand Núñez, the Spanish minister in London, who's shown on the right, which said, and I will spare you a Spanish accent, His Majesty, touched by your delicacy, does not wish to deprive you of that which has come into your possession by means as just as they are honourable. And as proof of his view that looting was no better than theft, Wellington not only tried, albeit unsuccessfully, to return the King of Spain's pictures, but he also organised the repatriation of much of Napoleon's European loot after the Allied victory at Waterloo in 1815. However, and this is not a contradiction, at the same time, the Duke supported the capture of spoils of war. And these included the contents of Tipu Sultan's palace and treasury after the Battle of Seringapatam in 1799, which produced an absolutely massive haul of tiger-themed spoils, some of which I illustrate in this slide, including a mechanical organ in the top left, now in the V&A, bits from Tipu's gold and jewel-encrusted throne, on which he never actually sat because the auspices were never quite right, which are now at Powys Castle in the Royal Collection and elsewhere. Indeed, some of those finials shown in the centre are actually lost. So I suspect that they're bogeyed away in a dusty old trunk somewhere. Anyway, one day they may turn up. There was also a very large assortment of cannons and other weapons shown at the bottom of the slide. Now, Wellington was also, as I've already mentioned, very keen on the acquisition of battlefield trophies, such as the French eagle of the 8th Regiment of the Line, shown here, being captured at the Battle of Barossa on the 5th of March, 1811, by Sergeant Patrick Masterson of the 87th Regiment of Foot, later the Royal Irish Fusiliers. Actually, the first Irishman to seize the closely guarded colour was a young officer called Edward Keogh. However, as his hand grasped the staff, he was shot through the heart and then bayoneted, just to make sure he was well and truly dead. His place was taken by Sergeant Masterson, who prized the eagle from the hands of its dying ensign and shouted, and I won't attempt an Irish accent, I'm afraid, "But Jesus, boys, I have the cuckoo." He held onto it with Irish tenacity for the rest of the battle, and ever since it's been known as the cuckoo eagle. Although the original, I'm sorry to say, was stolen from the Royal Hospital in 1852, possibly in the mistaken belief that it was gold or silver gilt. In fact, the only bit of gold on it, other than the gilding, is the wreath around the eagle's neck. Now, in fact, the imperial eagles were, as I've just said, gilded bronze, and they'd been sculpted by Antoine Denis Chaudet on the left, and then cast and gilded by Pierre-Philippe Thomire, of whom, sadly, I can't find a portrait. So, if senior military commanders like Wellington understand the difference between loot and spoils, why do politicians and museum curators have such difficulties? I believe that the answer lies in an examination of both the items in question and the circumstances in which they were acquired. But instead of laying down the law on this subject, I'm going to spend the rest of this talk challenging you and your perceptions of the subject. And I'm going to do this by starting you on the battlefield and then moving you progressively away from the cannon's roar, whilst reminding you once again that spoils of war are any profits arising from victory, whilst loot is theft. So let's start on the battlefield. First with these items acquired by the British at Rorke's Drift in 1880, and now in a country house in Wiltshire belonging to the descendant of Lieutenant Gunville Bromhead VC. Are these shields and spears spoils of war, or are they loot? The answer to that question may lie in the fact that the Zulus have never asked for them back. In fact, far from whinging about the loss of their historical and cultural artifacts, a few years ago, the late Zulu king celebrated, as a guest of the successor regiment to the 24th Regiment of Foot, the epic struggle at the mission station, as illustrated in these photos taken during his visit to the Royal Welsh's Regimental Museum in Brecon. But this is by no means the only example in my book of battlefield trophies whose return has never been demanded. For example, the French have never asked for the return of these silver kettle drums taken from them on the battlefield of Dettingen in 1743, and ever since paraded at the head of a British Hussar regiment. Nor have the Russians asked for the return of the gilded figurehead of the Maladits captured during the Crimean War and now at Arundel Castle. Nor have the Chinese asked for the return of this silver-gilt snuff box taken from the old summer palace in Peking in 1860. And what about Napoleon's carriage and its contents captured after Waterloo and put on display, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, in London before being sold? That haul of spoils included not only dozens of loose diamonds, but also large quantities of silver plate and several nécessaires, all of which were made by Martin Guillaume Bionnet, shown on the left. Now, the nécessaires themselves contained literally dozens of items in silver gilt and included everything from decanters to a toothbrush. The Waterloo spoils also included Napoleon's iconic charger Marengo, who was found lying wounded on the battlefield. Has the French government or Napoleon's heirs ever asked for the return of the carriage, its contents, or Marengo's skeleton, now in the National Army Museum, or indeed the horse's silver and silver gilt mounted hooves, one of which is in the Household Cavalry Museum in London, and the other is in the Queen's Guard Officers' Mess at St James's Palace, where they both serve, well, one serves even today as a snuff box. They are in fact both snuff mills. The answer to my question that I've just posed is no. And the same is true of the United States government, which never demanded the return of these American colors, captured by Colonel Banastre Tarleton, shown on the left, during the War of Independence. This, I might say, was of enormous benefit to Tarleton's descendant, who in 2017 sold them at auction in New York to a private American buyer for a mere $17.5 million. In fact, when it comes to items taken from or found on the field of battle, there's really only one category of spoils for which there has ever been a persistent demand for repatriation, although interestingly, the requests come invariably from the military, not from the Ministry of Culture. And the spoils in question are the aforementioned French imperial eagles, of which we, the British, have a rather large collection, only some of which I've shown here. Now, in researching my book, I found many requests from the French army for their return, and actually only one example of a temporary loan. Indeed, the British military's attitude to this subject is best summed up by the successors to the Royal Scots Greys, who, as shown in this slide, captured the eagle of the 45th Regiment, that's it on the left, at the Battle of Waterloo. This was an event that the regiment commemorated with a fine piece of mess silver, but their answer to any Frenchman requesting the eagle's return is invariably, if you want it, come and get it. And it would be a very brave man who took up that challenge. Now, I want to move now from the battlefield to the immediate aftermath of battle and the surrounding real estate on which our troops found many trophies, most of which were neither weapons nor equipment. Here too, I've discovered little appetite for their return. Take, for example, Hitler's desk, taken from the Führer bunker at the end of the Battle for Berlin in 1945, and now in the Keep Museum in Dorchester. Or how about these? On the top left, they're Eva Braun's knickers, and they were found by American troops at Hitler's ruined Berghof. And what about this rather handsome chair, taken at the fall of Sevastopol in 1855, and now in the Cheshire Military Museum in Chester? Neither Frau Merkel nor President Putin appear to be threatening sanctions if their respective nations' furniture and underwear is not returned. Nor have the descendants of Joseph Bonaparte, or indeed the French government, asked for the return of this particular household item, which was captured by the 14th Hussars at the Battle of Vittoria and has been used ever since, and presumably after a good scrub, as a loving cup in the Hussars officers' mess. Nor have they asked for this small silver beaker taken from Joseph's coach by a chap called Captain Arthur Kennedy, and still in the possession of his family, one of whom is in the audience today. So, if with the exception of eagles, there is no appetite on the part of defeated nations for the repatriation or restitution of spoils of war from the battlefield and its immediate surroundings, are these world leaders right not to make such demands? If you were in the seat of power in Moscow, Beijing, Paris, Berlin, or Washington, would you have been asking for the return of any of the items I've just described? Let's assume for a moment that your answer is no. So wherein do the problems for Britain's museums arise? The answer seems to be with spoils of war acquired at prize auctions and under peace treaties. So let's start by looking at the British military system of prize auctions, which started in the 18th century and lasted through until the end of the 19th. Sadly, few images exist of prize auctions. You see the one here held in Peking in 1860, but they all ran along very much the same lines. In the immediate aftermath of a battle or the successful conclusion of a siege, the commanding general would appoint a prize committee headed by a prize agent, whose job was to gather together anything portable that had belonged to the enemy military, catalogue it, and sell it all at a prize auction to the highest bidder. Proceeds of the sale would then, as the silver lining to this dark cloud of combat, be divided up amongst the victorious soldiers according to rank. Up until the middle of the 19th century, the bidders at these auctions would, more often than not, be officers with cash to spare and a nose for a bargain. Sometimes the officers would actually pool their prize money and buy a memento of the battle, such as these silver trumpets. The one on the left was commissioned by the 10th Hussars, and the one on the right by the 18th Hussars, with the money they received from the auction of French cavalry horses after Waterloo. And just to digress for a moment, there were some 30,000 horses on the battlefield at Waterloo, 10,000 Allied and 20,000 French. And if you'd lined them up in a single line, just to give you some idea of the sheer scale of the number of horses, if they'd all lined up in a single line, knee to knee, as we'd say in the cavalry, that line would have stretched for 25 miles. So there was plenty of horse flesh at Waterloo, and some of it was used to buy these trumpets. Now, some spoils never actually made it to the auction because they'd been earmarked for the monarch, as in the case of this gold thread encrusted Mameluke robe that was used as a dressing gown by Napoleon, found at Waterloo and sent by Marshal Blucher in the middle there as a gift to the Prince Regent. And it's actually still on display in Windsor Castle. Other items, such as cannons, tended to be earmarked for the Board of Ordnance, which would place the trophies in prominent locations, such as Tipu Sultan's Tiger cannons here at the RMA Sandhurst, and there are quite a few of them too at Powys Castle, and these Waterloo cannons at the Tower of London. Or they would use the metal to melt down and create monuments to the victor, such as this one, which you probably know as the Achilles statue, but its official name is the Wellington Monument at Hyde Park Corner. Now, this was cast from French cannons and paid for by a slightly unlikely group of people who, as you'll see in a moment, had some embarrassment. They were called the Ladies of England. And you may be amused to learn that when the much larger than life-size monument was unveiled without a fig leaf, it caused a very considerable stir, given that the face on the statue was that of the notoriously randy Archduke himself. Now, in looking at prize auctions, it's important to note that from the mid-19th century onwards, representatives of British museums would attend and bid. And in one case that I'll come to in a moment, the auction was actually held in London rather than at the site of the battle, thereby attracting foreign buyers as well. Now, whilst this was good news for the soldiery, it has, I'm afraid, caused problems for posterity. Probably the best known of these auctions, and actually the ones that have caused the most trouble since, were those that occurred clockwise from the top left on this slide, from the end of the Second Opium War in 1860, the Battle of Magdala, top right, in 1868, the capture of Mandalay, bottom right, 1885, and the Benin expedition of 1897. Now, in order to help you reach a judgment as to whether or not museums should continue to hold spoils resulting from these conflicts, let's look at each one of them in turn, starting with the sacking of the Old Summer Palace in Peking, which marked the effective end of the Second Opium War in 1860. Now, this act of destruction was not wanton. It was actually a carefully considered act of punishment by Lord Elgin, son of the Marbles man, and his French counterpart de Montauban, for the simply appalling atrocities deliberately inflicted on a European diplomatic mission that had been sent to parley with the Chinese under a flag of truce, who were then treacherously imprisoned, brutally tortured, and finally painfully executed in the Board of Punishment in Peking on the direct orders of the legitimate Chinese government. The Old Summer Palace was, in fact, a complex of palaces set in 350 acres of highly manicured gardens for the exclusive use of the emperor and his family. And it was that exclusivity that actually drove the two commanders to decide that that's where they would hit the Chinese emperor rather than hitting the Chinese people by destroying something else. Anyway, the contents of the new Summer Palace, the Old Summer Palace, were very extensive indeed. As shown here at an exhibition in Paris in 1862, each building was absolutely stuffed to the gunnels with the accumulation of hundreds of years of collecting by the Chinese emperors. Indeed, some of the items were over 3,000 years old. And the prize auction produced some really quite extraordinary spoils of war, including these items, which have subsequently been sold at various times for hundreds of thousands of pounds, and included, I might say, successful Chinese bids to recover several of them. The most notable being 5 of the bronze head from the famous water clock illustrated here. Also included in the spoils from the old summer palace was a Pekingese dog that had belonged to the Chinese Empress. And this dog was presented to Queen Victoria by a chap called John Hart Dunn. The Queen immediately, but rather unhelpfully for the purposes of this talk, named him Lootie, and immediately had him immortalized in oils. This is indeed the oil painting. So here's the question. Should all of the contents of the old summer palace, or at least those in public collections, such as these items at Fontainebleau, be sent back to Beijing on the grounds that, with 21st century hindsight, the destruction of the old summer palace and the sale of its contents may not have been a proportionate response to the horrors perpetrated by the Chinese? Before you formulate an answer, let's turn now to the prize auction after the Battle of Magdala in 1868, which frankly is even more problematic, particularly given the rather underwhelming reasons for the launch of the punitive expedition in the first place. In a nutshell, Emperor Theodore II of Abyssinia, shown here on the left, in order to try and gain the attention of the British, somewhat ill-advisedly imprisoned a number of British subjects without charge. I might add that these were the days when the words written on the inside cover of your passport actually meant something. This action spectacularly backfired on the emperor when, instead of a diplomatic mission to secure the release of the imprisoned Brits, we sent an Anglo-Indian army of 13,000 men under the Commander General Napier to rescue the hostages. Emperor Theodore's army was easily defeated at the cost of just 2 British soldiers. The prisoners were released unharmed from the fortress at Magdala, although not before Theodore had ordered 300 Ethiopian prisoners to be thrown over the neighboring cliff, following which the emperor then shot himself. And he used a pistol, rather ironically, that had been given to him in happier times by Queen Victoria herself. So great was the Abyssinian haul of spoils on sale at the prize auction that it required 15 elephants and nearly 200 mules to transport the lots to the plain of Delanta below the burning fortress. The prize auction included, whoops, sorry, something's gone wrong here. Hang on a second. Right. The prize auction actually included hundreds of historical manuscripts collected by the late emperor, as well as the contents of his treasury and his imperial regalia. And of particular significance in the history of spoils of war and the current debate about repatriation are an item known as the drum of gold, although it is in fact silver, that's the one shown on the left, the emperor's crowns, just 2 of which I'm showing here, and the book on the right, which is called The Glory of Kings. Now the saga is too long to recount here in detail, although you can read about it in full in my book, but in summary, the so-called drum of gold was not auctioned because it had been claimed by all 3 of the British regiments in the expeditionary force. Appropriately, given where he was, Napier displayed the wisdom of Solomon and ordered that the drum be cut into 3 pieces, with each regiment receiving a section. In 1928, which is the date of this photograph, the drum was reassembled for a 50th anniversary event, at which time it was photographed. When again, however, the pieces were once again brought together, they didn't fit. And it was found that that photograph I've just shown you had actually been fudged. Somehow or other it had been manipulated. And it's a mystery to this very day that remains unsolved as to why the 3 pieces did not fit. Anyway, it's not stopped all 3 regiments resisting persistent calls from the Ethiopian government for the drum's return. Not so, as I'm showing on this slide, other items that following the death of Theodore have been returned. First of all, on the left, you see the book of the Glory of Kings. Now, the British government wanted to ingratiate itself with Theodore's successor, and at his request, they repatriated this book, a sort of Abyssinian Almanac de Gotha that gave the emperor the right to reign and was held by the British Museum. 50 years later, again, for purely political reasons, one of Theodore's crowns, shown in this cartoon on the right, that had been held at the V&A, was also returned. Importantly, to the three regiments. Importantly, none of these items that were returned at that time had to be deaccessioned because they didn't actually belong to the museums. They actually belonged to the Colonial Office. So they didn't have to be deaccessioned, which would have required an Act of Parliament. Nonetheless, their return has set a very unfortunate precedent for the V&A that it is finding very hard to resist. Should they give in to these demands? Again, please don't answer that question until you've considered the prize auction that followed the capture of Mandalay in Burma, which ended the third and last Anglo-Burmese War in 1885. The rights and wrongs of this conflict don't need to detain us here. But what you do need to know is that, as at Magdala, the prize auction that followed included the portable contents of King Thibaw Min's several palaces, including all the gold and silver royal regalia and the gilded lion throne shown on the right, which was just one of 8 thrones in the Amarapura Palace. And on the orders of the Viceroy, Lord Dufferin, the lion throne was taken to India, and it remained there until 1948. Meanwhile, the royal regalia was sent to the V&A, and there it was conserved and displayed until 1964, when, once again for political reasons, it was returned to Burma in the wake of the throne, which had been returned on Burmese independence. Now, as with the Magdala spoils, the repatriation was possible because these spoils were government, not museum property. However, and herein lies a key argument against repatriation, the 7 thrones that were not removed from Mandalay were all destroyed during the Second World War. And the Burmese government not only thanked the V&A for preserving the royal regalia, but actually, in gratitude, gave it back 2 of the items that had been returned. Which brings me to the prize auction held after the Benin punitive expedition of 1897, probably the most controversial of all. Now, unusually, although the spoils were assembled in Benin, the actual auction was held in London, and the proceeds were used to defray the costs of the expedition, which had been launched to avenge the so-called Benin massacre, in which a small force of British troops, trying to enforce previously negotiated trading rights, had been ambushed and slaughtered to a man. The sacking of Benin City, shown here, well, that's Benin City before it was sacked, by the punitive expeditionary force, and the removal and auction of the many items of bronze, ivory, and wood that was found there, was further justified at the time when it became very apparent to the horror of the Victorians, but not, it would seem, to 21st century moralists, that the citizens of Benin were very much given to human sacrifice. Now, in defense of this now highly controversial confiscation, I would like to add this thought. If Benin City had not been comprehensively stripped of its cultural heritage, where would the Benin bronzes and other Benin artifacts now be? Whilst under British rule, they would undoubtedly have remained in Nigeria until independence in 1960. But what would have happened to them after that? Given the Nigerian Civil War and the succession of corrupt governments under which Nigeria has since suffered, I suggest to you that the Benin bronzes and other Benin artifacts would have suffered the same fate as treasures in other unstable countries that have often been sold on the international art market or destroyed in conflict. And if that isn't enough of an argument for you, compare and contrast the number of people who've seen the bronzes in Western museums by comparison with the number who might have seen them in Nigeria, or who would see them there in the future. Indeed, I dread to think what will happen if the Belgian and French governments and various British institutions go ahead with their promise to return spoils of war to the Congo, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Somalia, and other unstable sub-Saharan countries. So what I'm saying is that even if you apply 21st century moral standards to 19th century military actions, which frankly, I believe is pretty meaningless and also intellectually dishonest, then there remains the powerful arguments around accessibility and conservation. Instead of bemoaning the present ownership of the Benin bronzes or the gold mask acquired during the Ashanti expedition shown on the right and now in the Wallace collection, we should actually be celebrating the fact that they've not gone the way of the Burmese thrones, the Buddhas of Bamiyan, or the temples of Bel and Nabu. Now, I recently debated this subject on the History Hit channel in a discussion chaired by Dan Snow. My interlocutor propounded the sincerely held, but in my view, utterly woke, not to say utterly daft belief that all spoils of war should be returned to their countries of origin, and that it was then up to those countries to do what they wanted with them, including destroying them. Now, I know that I won't have convinced all of you on this subject, but before I take your questions, we still have to consider the question of spoils of war arising from international treaties and take a brief look at loot. Now, to judge from last year's rumpus in Westminster and Brussels about government legalizing possible breaches of the EU withdrawal treaty, the terms of a treaty are sacrosanct. If that is correct, then the return of Gibraltar and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, to name just two at the top of the list, can frankly be rejected immediately and completely out of hand. Gibraltar was ceded to us in perpetuity in 1713 under the Treaty of Utrecht, and the Koh-i-Noor diamond was surrendered to the British Crown under Article 3 of the Treaty of Lahore in 1846. Its ownership by the British Crown was later confirmed by the previous owner, Maharaja Dulip Singh, shown on the left, who, I must admit, rather after the event, gave it to Queen Victoria, who wore it as a brooch, but sadly only after Prince Albert had ordered it to be recut, and in the process lost 75% of its volume. Since the coronation of King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, the Koh-i-Noor has been in the Queen Consort's crown, shown here, being worn by Queen Alexandra herself. And whilst on the subject of royal diamonds, and to make a bit of a detour, I'm afraid I simply can't resist showing you this photograph that I found of Queen Mary, wearing every cut, major cut that is, of the Cullinan diamond, which incidentally is not a spoil of war, including on her massive bust, the Cullinan 1 and 2, which are usually to be found in the imperial state crown and in the scepter. It's a great pity for the purposes of this photograph that she was not wearing the Koh-i-Noor. In any event, it's a wonder that she could move. But back to the matter in hand, which is spending the remaining time for this talk looking at the grey area between loot and spoils of war, whilst reminding ourselves yet again that spoils are profit and loot is theft. And to get the ball rolling again, let's consider some of the events of the Second World War, at the start of which Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering said, "I intend to plunder and to do it thoroughly," and then proceeded to acquire by force 25% of the art heritage of occupied Europe, just a fraction of which is shown here in storage after the war, and only 50% of which has been returned to its rightful owners, or indeed their descendants. Now, if anyone's in any doubt that this vast accumulation of art was anything other than loot, I'd like to know. I don't think it is. I think it's loot, pure and simple. Very well. If I'm right, let's look at a possible grey area of the subject. In 1945, the 1st Household Cavalry Regiment, a composite unit formed from the Life Guards and the Royal Horse Guards, was pushing deep into Western Germany. Regimental law, I'm afraid, is not quite clear as to where or how one HCR acquired a wooden maquette for a life-size or possibly larger statue of a naked man and woman. However, the Dry Roger, as the statue was immediately christened by Loosh lifeguards, has been proudly and prominently displayed in the regiment's officers' house ever since 1945. And in the years following the war, this mildly erotic statue travelled with the lifeguards to Singapore and back via Palestine, where it was frankly not improved by immersion in a bath, and to Cyprus, where the ladies' toes were unfortunately chipped. At various times, enterprising officers with an eye for anatomical detail have attempted to add some genital embellishment in cork. But despite all of this, the Dry Roger has survived remarkably well in its original state. But is it a spoil of war or is it loot? Before you decide, consider this. An Ormolu mounted reproduction bureau plat, currently acting as a desk in Headquarters Household Division at Horse Guards in London. It was taken after the war ended by the Irish Guards from a hotel on the banks of the Rhine called the Rhine Hotel Dresden. This was actually Hitler's favourite holiday resort, and he's said to have stayed in the hotel more than 70 times. He indeed had his own permanent suite there. And it was in that room and over this bureau plat that in 1938 Neville Chamberlain signed the so-called Bad Godesberg Agreement, which was a rapidly failed precursor to the Munich Agreement of the following week. But now here's the point. The hotel still exists. And here it is. So, if the bureau plat is loot, should it be returned to the hotel? Or do you think it's a legitimate spoil of war, even though it and the Dry Roger were only acquired well away from the battlefield? And what about this, a silver and silver gilt Admiral's baton belonging to Grand Admiral Dönitz, and now in a museum in Shrewsbury, which was taken from him when he was arrested in Flensburg on the 23rd of May 1945. Shortly before the Führer's suicide, Hitler had named Dönitz as his successor as president, a post that the Grand Admiral held for a mere 14 days, and which was followed fairly sharply by his trial at Nuremberg, where he was found guilty on 2 counts of planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression, and committing crimes against the laws of war, but was acquitted of conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity. We'd have let him go, but at the insistence of the Soviet government, he was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment in Spandau, from where he wasn't released until the 1st of October 1956. The ex-Grand Admiral lived on in retirement for the next 24 years, dying on Christmas Eve 1980, aged 89. And in his will, and despite the fact that he'd been relieved of his baton in 1945, Dönitz bequeathed it to the German Naval Veterans Organization, which is called the Deutscher Marienbund. And the will further specified that the baton was to be displayed in the German Submarine Services Naval Memorial and Museum near Kiel, shown here on the right. No sooner was the will published than the veteran German submariners promptly demanded its return on the grounds that it was not, it had belonged, on the grounds that it was the personal possession of the late Grand Admiral and could therefore not be deemed to be a spoil of war. The Shrewsbury Museum consulted their lawyers, who, before reaching a decision, looked at the legal precedent set by the acquisition and retention of Marshal Jourdan's Napoleonic silver gilt baton that's been in the Royal Collection ever since 1815. Unfortunately, they ruled that Dönitz's baton was indeed a legitimate spoil of war. So the Shropshire Museum was able to reply with a firm 9. And there, for the moment, I'm going to allow the matter to rest. But, and I want you, of course, to work out your own approach to this very fraught subject. But whilst you do so, consider this. If spoils of war should be repatriated, to where should they be sent? Just think about this particular disputed spoil of war, which I haven't previously mentioned. as I'm sure you all know, it's the Rosetta Stone currently held in the British Museum. It was acquired in 1801 under a treaty, Article 16 of a treaty called the Capitulation of Alexandria. And it was acquired by General John Healy Hutchinson, later Earl of Drogamore, who following his defeat of the French in Egypt, who in their turn under Napoleon had defeated the Mamluk rulers led by Ibrahim Bey at the Battle of the Pyramids in 1798, got his hands on it. Now the French now want the return of this decree of the Greek pharaoh Ptolemy V, but they found it in Egypt, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire, albeit ruled by the Georgian Mamelukes. So if it is to be repatriated, should it go to Tbilisi, or Paris, or Athens, or Cairo, or Istanbul, or even Healy Hutchinson's home city of Cork? I hope you've enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have the time, there are more spoils of war that you can read about, some of which I'm happy to tell you are silver, including Joan of Arc's ring and Colonel Uraby's coffee pot. And you can get it at a discounted price. Sorry, here comes the advertisement. You can get it at a discounted price from the Silver Society. Sorry, not from the Silver Society, but direct from my publishers if you use the code on this slide. Anyway, there we are. And I'm very happy to take your questions if you have any.
Christopher, thank you very, very much indeed. That was terrific. Now I will have a look. First of all, Michael comments, I believe that the Magdala material returned in the 1930s is now lost. Reza Benin, the material was all, I think, in the Obar's palace, which still stands and is still the Obar's residence. It seems unlikely that the Obars would have sold such material given its ancestral importance. I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to say about that, or if...
I don't think the Obars would have been given a choice by some corrupt Nigerian president. We only have to look at what happened to the contents of the Iraqi museum in Kuwait when it was overrun by Saddam Hussein. Now, he claimed that Kuwait was part of the greater Iraq, and he had some grounds for saying so, in as much that it had originally been part of Mesopotamia. But the contents of that museum, which were returned to Baghdad, or taken to Baghdad, the vast majority of them have since disappeared, and indeed have cropped up from time to time on the international art market. I just think, you know, it is an incredibly difficult question. The fact of the matter is that thanks to what we did, and I use the word thanks advisedly, thanks to what we did, an awful lot of things that might have been destroyed are now preserved. Okay, let the debate commence on whether they should stay here or whether they should go back. But a part and parcel of that discussion should, in my view, be how stable are the regions into which these things might be sent back.
Mm-hmm. Right, then Jane asks, how often are the British asked to return spoils or loot? Yes, I think we know the sort of the well-known ones, but are there, do you know of others, other examples where sort of which haven't hit the headlines?
Frankly, no, I don't. Pretty much all the ones that are current, I talked about in this talk. I mean, the French witter on occasionally about wanting some of their captured colours back, but actually they've got almost as many of our colours hanging in the Invalides as we have of theirs. And I think the general view is that things lie where they fall.
Yes, and then someone whose name I don't know says, does any nation have anything we might like back that we might have accidentally dropped?
That's a very good question. I have actually been asked that question in a slightly different format, and I'll give you the answer that I gave in a different talk because I think it hits the spot. The fact of the matter is that spoils of war end up in the possession of the victors. And since the 18th century, we've tended to be on the winning side, which is why we've got so many of them. I mean, there are literally hundreds of thousands of items of spoils of war dotted around in museums and private collections the length and breadth of this country. Because we haven't very often lost, there aren't very many items belonging to us that are in foreign collections, but there are one or two, because, you know, before the 18th century, we weren't always on the winning side. And I'm sure, actually, I'm not sure of this, but, you know, would we like to have the Aquitaine back? Would we like to have Calais back? You know, at one point, Britain owned more than half of France. You know, there are all these questions kicking around. I think the answer is, I think we take a pretty robust view of this. If somebody took it from us under reasonable circumstances, then that's where it should lie. Which actually, funnily enough, brings me back to the point about Second World War loot. This whole question about what should happen to artworks that were forcibly removed or for which a pittance was paid by the German government for items not exclusively belonging to Jewish families, but largely belonging to Jewish families. If they found their way into British collections, in my view, they should go back. I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that. They are loot. They are not spoils of war.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask, with the prize auctions, where did the money go? If you've had all your officers after, you know, bidding away, where did the actual funds go? Oh,
they were, as I think I said, they were divided up according to rank amongst the victorious soldiers.
Sorry, I missed that bit.
So, of course, if you were a private, you got rather less than if you were a general.
Okay, thank you.
Which is why a lot of, you know, a lot of our landed families now, particularly like the Clives at Powys Castle, were very substantially enriched as a result of these prize auctions.
Yeah. Well, I think we've now come to the end of the questions. There's comment, there have been various comments saying that we should ask for Calais back.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's become very French. And then Peter Kalgren from the museum in Toronto says that they have a tapestry from the cathedral in Addis Ababa. So yeah, I think it is extraordinary how these objects are sort of scattered across the world. But thank you very much indeed, Christopher. And I would like to remind everybody that the next talk will be on the 19th of May, when Craig O'Donnell of the Birmingham Assay Office will be talking about arts and crafts silver in the Midlands. So thank you all very much for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a few weeks' time. Bye-bye.
Lucy, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye.